Lecture 10, Part 2 of the Varieties of Religious Experience. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James. Lecture 10, Conversion Concluded. Part 2. The believers in the non-natural character of sudden conversion have had practically to admit that there is no unmistakable class mark distinctive of all true converts. The supernormal incidents, such as voices and visions and overpowering impressions of the meaning of suddenly presented scripture texts, the melting emotions and tumultuous affections connected with the crisis of change, may all come by way of nature, or worse still, be counterfeited by Satan. The real witness of the Spirit to the second birth is to be found only in the disposition of the genuine child of God, the permanently patient heart, the love of self-eradicated. And this, it has to be admitted, is also found in those who pass no crisis, and may even be found outside of Christianity altogether. Throughout Jonathan Edwards' admirably rich and delicate description of the supernaturally infused condition, in his treatise on religious affections, there is not one decisive trait, not one mark, that unmistakably parts it off from what may possibly be only an exceptionally high degree of natural goodness. In fact, one could hardly read a clearer argument than this book unwittingly offers in favor of the thesis that no chasm exists between the orders of human excellence, but that here, as elsewhere, nature shows continuous differences, and generation and regeneration are matters of degree. All which denial of two objective classes of human beings separated by a chasm must not leave us blind to the extraordinary momentousness of the fact of his conversion to the individual himself who gets converted. There are higher and lower limits of possibility set to each personal life. If a flood but goes above one's head, its absolute elevation becomes a matter of small importance, and when we touch our own upper limit, and live in our own highest center of energy, we may call ourselves saved, no matter how much higher someone else's center may be. The small man's salvation will always be a great salvation, and the greatest of all facts for him, and we should remember this when the fruits of our ordinary evangelicism look discouraging. Who knows how much less ideal still the lives of these spiritual grubs and earthworms, these crumps and stingences, might have been, if such poor grace as they have received had never touched them at all. Footnote. Emerson writes, quote, "When we see a soul whose acts are regal, graceful, and pleasant as roses, we must thank God that such things can be and are, and not turn sourly on the angel and say, 'Crump is a better man, with his grunting resistance to all his native devils.'" Close quote. True enough, yet Crump may really be the better Crump for his inner discords and second birth, and your once-born regal character, though indeed always better than poor Crump, may fall far short of what he individually might be had he only some Crump-like capacity for compunction over his own peculiar diabolisms, graceful and pleasant and invariably gentlemanly as these may be. End footnote. If we roughly arrange human beings in classes, each class standing for a grade of spiritual excellence, I believe we shall find natural men and converts, both sudden and gradual, in all the classes. The forms which regenerative change effects have, then, no general spiritual significance, but only a psychological significance. We have seen how Starbuck's laborious statistical studies tend to assimilate conversion to ordinary spiritual growth. Another American psychologist, Professor George A. Coe, has analyzed the cases of 77 converts or ex-candidates for conversion, known to him, and the results strikingly confirm the view that sudden conversion is connected with the possession of an active subliminal self. Examining his subjects with reference to their hypnotic sensibility and to such automatisms as hypnagogic hallucinations, odd impulses, religious dreams about the time of their conversion, etc., he found these relatively much more frequent in the group of converts whose transformation had been striking. Striking transformation being defined as a change which, though not necessarily instantaneous, seems to the subject of it to be distinctly different from a process of growth, however rapid. Candidates for conversion at revivals are, as you know, often disappointed. They experienced nothing striking. Professor Coe had a number of persons of this class among his 77 subjects, and they almost all, when tested by hypnotism, proved to belong to a subclass which he calls spontaneous, that is, fertile in self-suggestions, as distinguished from a passive subclass, to which most of the subjects of striking transformation belonged. His inference is that self-suggestion of impossibility had prevented the influence upon these persons of an environment which, on the more passive subjects, had easily brought forth the effects they looked for. Sharp distinctions are difficult in these regions, and Professor Coe's numbers are small. But his methods were careful, and the results tally with what one might expect, and they seem, on the whole, to justify his practical conclusion, which is that if you should expose to a converting influence a subject in whom three factors unite, first, pronounced emotional sensibility, second, tendency to automatisms, and third, suggestibility of the passive type, you might then safely predict the result. There would be a sudden conversion, a transformation of the striking kind. Does this temperamental origin diminish the significance of the sudden conversion when it has occurred? Not in the least, as Professor Coe well says, for, quote, "The ultimate test of religious values is nothing psychological, nothing definable in terms of how it happens, but something ethical, definable only in terms of what is attained." Close quote. As we proceed farther in our inquiry, we shall see that what is attained is often an altogether new level of spiritual vitality, a relatively heroic level in which impossible things have become possible, and new energies and endurances are shown. The personality is changed, the man is born anew, whether or not his psychological idiosyncrasies are what give the particular shape to his metamorphosis. Sanctification is the technical name of this result, and ere long examples of it shall be brought before you. In this lecture I have still only to add a few remarks on the assurance and peace which fill the hour of change itself. One word more, though, before proceeding to that point, lest the final purpose of my explanation of suddenness by subliminal activity be misunderstood. I do indeed believe that if the subject have no liability to such subconscious activity, or if his conscious fields have a hard rind of a margin that resists incursions from beyond it, his conversion must be gradual if it occur, and must resemble any simple growth into new habits. His possession of a developed subliminal self and of a leaky or pervious margin is thus a conditio sine qua non of the subject's becoming converted in the instantaneous way. But if you, being orthodox Christians, ask me as a psychologist whether the reference of a phenomenon to the subliminal self does not exclude the notion of the direct presence of the deity altogether, I have to say frankly that, as a psychologist, I do not see why it necessarily should. The lower manifestations of the subliminal, indeed, fall within the resources of the personal subject. His ordinary sense material, inattentively taken in and subconsciously remembered and combined, will account for all his usual automatisms. But just as our primary wide-awake consciousness throws open our senses to the touch of things material, so it is logically conceivable that if there be higher